Hello everyone, my name is CEO for SEOtheproducer.com and the Producers Blog, and today we're talking about, oh shit, you've guessed it, sweet drum compression. Okay, so what is a compressor? Well, a compressor is an audio processor that helps us control the dynamic range of a signal. The dynamic range being the difference in volume between the quietest and loudest parts of a signal. So, although that's the most basic and fundamental concept about compression, to me, it is more about character and sound. And as you can see here, I have a few pulled up, and they all have their own individual sound and purpose. They don't all work on every single instrument, and to me it's really important that an engineer or a producer learns to really understand and feel and hear the sound of a compressor. And the only way to do it, in my opinion, is to get one compressor, use it for let's say a week, a full week, a month or 6 months, and only use that compressor and use it on every single instrument that you can. Try a billion different settings, use it on drums, on vocals, on synths, on whatever, and you'll slowly start to understand what it's really doing to the sound and how it is manipulating the sound. Especially if you have hardware compressors, this is even more important because you can really tell the characteristic of that specific compressor. So I'm gonna close these ones for now, and as we don't really need them, and I'm gonna pull them up later anyway, we're gonna talk about them later, and I'm just gonna pull up the basic Logic compressor. It sounds okay, it works, it does what it's supposed to do, and all DAWs have their own basic compressor. You can insert 1,000 of them in a project and they won't be so CPU intensive as others might be, other third-party plugins might be, so, you know, it's a good starting point. So let's focus on the settings, on the controls for a second. And we have a threshold, attack and release, ratio, knee, and gain. I'm not going to focus on the other ones. I'm not going to talk about the other ones because we don't really care about them, first, and secondly, most other compressors don't usually have those controls. So let's just focus on these 5 or 6 that we've talked about. So I have a nice little beat that I made with Contact, this brilliant Abbey Road Modern Drummer patch for Contact, and I'll just play you. Let me just unmute those MIDI notes, and I'll play you this beat just so you have an idea, and then we'll talk about it more in depth. Okay, so nice beat, nice sound, but who cares about the beat right now? So let's focus on the compression, and I'm gonna mute the hat and kick so we can focus on the snare and listen to what the relationship in volume is between the quieter notes and the louder notes. Okay, so we can see that it's very dynamic, and we have some really quiet notes and some really loud notes. And what if we wanted to make those two more even between each other? We can use compression. So let's look at the threshold control. The threshold control is basically setting the level at which the compression is engaged. So only when a level passes above that threshold, it'll be compressed. So let's look at this, for example. In this case, we've got minus 20 dB. So whenever a signal exceeds that minus 20, it'll get compressed. So let's look at this snare drum pattern, and let's look at the gain reduction meter to see if something is actually getting compressed or not. Okay, so immediately we're seeing the louder notes getting compressed while the quieter notes are not. So let's try to push down the threshold even more, and let's get it to a point where it's compressing both the louder notes and the quieter notes. Okay, so now we're getting compression on both the quiet notes and the loud notes. Now we need to move on to the ratio, so we can increase the amount of compression that is being applied, because remember that the threshold is just setting the level at which the compressor is being engaged. So the ratio is nothing else than the amount of compression or attenuation or reduction that is being applied to the signal once it exceeds the threshold. So if I set the ratio at 1, it's basically saying I'm not compressing anything. And this is how it sounds. Right, it sounds exactly like before because it's not compressing anything. Well, if we start increasing that ratio control, then we'll see how it is affecting our signal. So to me, the ratio is basically saying how aggressive is the sound of the compressor going to be. So the higher the ratio, the more aggressive it's going to sound. The more aggressive it's going to kill the transients and the attack of the signal. And this brings us to the attack. The attack is basically saying how long will the compressor start to react to the signal once it exceeds the threshold. Basically, how much of the transient is going to come through, how much of the attack is going to come through, the attack of the signal I'm talking about. So let's again put the ratio at something like 4:1 or something, reasonable, and let's play around with the ratio, with the attack. And let's pull down the release so it's not affecting anything. Notice how the snare drum starts to become really soft when the attack is really fast, like in this case, 0 milliseconds, so it's basically immediately catching the transient. And in an opposite way, how much more punchy and attacky, if that's a word, is getting once the attack is getting slower. When the attack is really fast, it sounds sort of muffled, almost muffled, because you're killing all the transients, all the attack, which might work for some things but might not work for others. So let's move on to the release and see how that affects the sound. And to me, the release is basically how long will the compressed signal take to go back to the original state of non-compressed signal. So basically, the signal goes through the threshold, it exceeds the threshold, the ratio kills the peak that went through and tells it to attenuate it by X amount of dBs. The attack will say how long will I need to wait before I can grab onto that attack, that peak, and the release will say how long after the signal came through should I release it back to the original state of non-compressed signal. Now that's the basic explanation of how a compressor works. Now let's listen to the release and how it affects the signal. Now, it can be difficult to hear how it is really affecting the signal, but think about it this way. If the release isn't releasing in time and quickly enough for the next drum hit, that next drum hit will still be compressed from the previous hit. And we can see it right here, for example. Look. If I set the release... Oh, let me pull it down so you can hear me. If I set the release fairly quickly, every snare hit will basically get compressed individually. So to me, when the release is in time with the music, every note sounds much crisper because they're not getting compressed as much, and the release is going back to non-compressed extremely quickly, or in time with the music, in time for the next hit. Okay, so let's talk about the gain for a second. So whenever you compress a signal, you effectively reduce the perceived volume and actual volume of the compressed signal. So you need something to pull that signal back up. And we use the gain to do this. Now, I'm gonna play the snare drum again and note how the uncompressed signal sounds crisp and loud, and the compressed signal instead will start to sound much duller and lower in volume. So we need that gain to pull up that compression again. So and here we go. So we've got a really nice level where the uncompressed signal and the compressed signal are more or less at the same volume, output volume, but the compressed signal obviously is much more aggressive and has much more ambience and all those sort of characteristics. That's all we have time for today. Make sure to like and subscribe, And drop a comment below if you'd like to see something else in the next video, if you didn't understand something from this one, and I'll see you in the next episode.